Hi, welcome to my weekly Parsha share. This week we will be looking at Parshat Vayishlach. Thank you so much to Aaron and Lillian Fuchs and Jason Fuchs for sponsoring this share in memory of Lillian's brother and Jason's uncle, Jack Julius Glatter, Yaakov Yehuda ben Yitzchak, Zichron Levracha, whose yahrzeit is on the 14th of Kislev. May his neshama have an aliyah. We should be zeichet tchias hamesim. I want to begin by addressing something that is on our mind and has been on our mind for more than 2 years. In the aftermath of October 7th, Israel's response was immediate, it was overwhelming, and it was unapologetically forceful. Gaza was invaded, Hamas was targeted forcefully. Hezbollah in Lebanon was obliterated, Yemen was bombed, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, for the first time in its history, was hit directly on its own soil. Military analysts all over the world were quick to point out that Israel seemed to have shifted overnight from a policy of managing threats to one of eliminating them. And there was a reason for that. October 7th wasn't an attack, it was a rupture, a deliberate unmasking of genocidal intent by Israel's enemies. The brutality, the planning, the declarations from Hamas itself all signaled that there was the idea of coexistence. That idea was a fantasy, and no understanding could be reached with these avowed enemies of the Jewish people. There's no diplomatic horizon that's waiting politely in the wings. Israel realized that it was facing a movement whose goal wasn't territorial correction. Their goal is annihilation, and that required a forceful response. But here's the interesting thing. Israel does not treat every adversary or even every enemy the same way. At the very same time, Israel was waging an existential battle in Gaza and confronting Yemen and Iran and Hezbollah. Israeli diplomats were still vigorously maintaining the Abraham Accords and pursuing its expansion. Even as rockets were falling, Israel was on the phone with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. Long-term strategic agreements continued to develop beneath the smoke of war. The language coming from Jerusalem about Saudi Arabia remained remarkably optimistic, even warm. Israel was fighting one set of actors ferociously, yet actively courting another set that only a few years ago would never have been considered partners, certainly not partners for peace. All of this raises a fascinating question. Why does Israel destroy Hamas, attack Hezbollah, and strike Iran, but at the same time embrace the UAE, deepen ties with Bahrain, and negotiate with Saudi Arabia? Why does one group elicit missiles and another receives handshakes and diplomatic outreach? The simple answer is that the Middle East doesn't operate on a friend-enemy binary. It operates on a threat-trust spectrum. Take the UAE. It is not a democracy, it's not a Western liberal state, and certainly not an ideological soulmate of Israel. But the UAE made a strategic calculation. Stability, prosperity, and cooperation with Israel serve its interests far better than supporting radicalism. And when Arab states show pragmatism, responsibility, and a willingness to live in a region where Jews also belong, Israel reciprocates. Saudi Arabia is similar, even if its public rhetoric is more cautious. The Saudis don't love Israel. They aren't likely to invite Israeli schoolchildren to Riyadh on exchange programs anytime soon. But they understand precisely who threatens their kingdom. And it isn't Israel, it's Iran. It's the coalition of extremist groups, the Muslim Brotherhood, that want to upend their monarchy and export revolutionary chaos into the Gulf. So Saudi Arabia and Israel flirt with normalization because deep down, maybe not so deep down, they share a strategic worldview. Iran, on the other hand, has built its entire national identity around exporting revolution. Hezbollah exists solely to implement that revolution in Lebanon. Hamas is an existential threat to Israel and Jews, and Israel understands that you can't negotiate with a movement, with people whose raison d'être is your destruction. You can negotiate and even flourish with governments that prefer stability to apocalypse, but you can't do that with people who have no strategic or tactical interest to normalize relations. Since October 7th, people outside Israel have struggled to understand this calibration. They look at Israel's aggressive posture towards Hamas and Iran and conclude Israel is warmongering. But then they look at Israel's warm embrace of the UAE and its desire to normalize with Saudi Arabia, and then they must surely say, well, that's confusing. Actually, it's not confusing at all. It's the deepest level of clarity. The fact that Israel can wage a bitter war in Gaza and, at the very same time, negotiate historic alliances in the Gulf is not hypocrisy, it is maturity. It shows a profound ability to discriminate between regimes and movements that can be partners, even if awkward ones, and those that can never be. Once you appreciate this distinction, the modern Middle East makes far more sense. And, as it turns out, so does Parshat Vayishlach, because this week's Parsha presents the very same dilemma. How do you respond to a dangerous adversary in one moment and an outright predator in another? How do you calibrate appeasement, diplomacy, confrontation, and force? And how do you explain to the world, or even to yourself, why some enemies are fought and others are embraced? That, of course, is where Yaakov Avinu, Esav, Shechem, Dinah, Shimon and Levi come in, and where Parshat Vayishlach gives us a framework to understand Israel's reality today. When Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, hears that Esav is approaching with 400 men, and they are not exactly a friendly group of innocent citizens, he doesn't freeze, he doesn't panic, but he also doesn't leap into battle. He doesn't get into battle mode. Instead, the Torah tells us he prepares in three parallel ways. Firstly, diplomacy, doron. Secondly, prayer, tefillah. And finally, military readiness, milchama. This three-track response becomes the classic Jewish strategy for facing danger. But each commentator explains it slightly differently. And when you put them together, something remarkable emerges. A Torah blueprint for distinguishing between an adversary you can work with and an enemy you must confront. Rashi notes that Yaakov sends messengers first with respectful language and conciliatory gifts. Why? Because Yaakov knows Esav is complicated. He's resentful, he's unpredictable, but he is not apparently genocidal. Esav is an adversary, but he's not the Esav of 20 years ago, who was angry and hell-bent on murder. He is older and open to talking. Bottom line, you don't fight every enemy. Some enemies can be stabilized via the diplomatic approach. Of course, Yaakov isn't naive. He prepares for war, but he also gives the Esav of now the opportunity not to be the Esav of the past. This is exactly what Israel does with countries like the UAE or even Saudi Arabia. There's no illusions, no rose-colored glasses, but there is also no inevitability in seeing this adversary is only ready to destroy you. If you extend a hand, you can see how the other side responds. Ramban famously writes that Yaakov's actions at the beginning of Parshat Vayishlach are not merely a one-time crisis management tactic. They are a Torah model for Jewish foreign policy, as it were, in times of vulnerability. Yaakov's appeasement of Esav, Ramban notes, becomes the template for how Jews must act in exile. Noagim anu kach begolusenu. We do not rely on miracles. We take every practical measure available, and we use diplomacy, humility, and strategic restraint as tools of survival. But, as is obvious from the narrative itself, this approach is only valid when diplomacy has the capacity to protect us. When appeasement cannot prevent harm, Ramban does not suggest we cling to it blindly. Ramban's point is subtle but critical. Diplomacy is not cowardice, it is strategy. A nation that understands its long-term needs does not pick unnecessary fights. This is why Israel warmly maintains the Abraham Accords, while simultaneously strengthening its military posture. With states that show stability and rational interests, Israel follows the Ramban model. Appeasement in the noble sense, an attempt at peaceful coexistence grounded in realism. The Sforno emphasizes that Jacob, divided the camp not because he wanted war, but because he wants survival. He assumes the moral burden of last resort. If Esav attacks, we will be forced to fight. We might be forced into battle, but we are not eager for battle. Sforno sees war as a tragic obligation, not a preferred option. And this distinction matters enormously today. Israel does not wake up each morning looking for someone to bomb. When dealing with Saudi Arabia or Bahrain, Israel takes the Sforno approach. Maximize diplomacy, minimize conflict. Keep your army and air force state of the art and battle ready, and fight only when you must. With Hamas, by contrast, war can never be Plan C. On October 7th, Hamas made all-out war Plan A by choosing massacre over coexistence. Rav Hirsch flips the entire narrative. Yaakov's deference, sending gifts, displaying humility, none of this reflects weakness, he says. It reflects moral courage and self-control. Rav Hirsch argues that Yaakov models a profound idea. A morally grounded nation seeks peace even when fully capable of war. Yaakov is bowing and deferential, not because Esav is superior, but because he refuses to escalate tension unnecessarily. He refuses to be the catalyst for violence. This is the Abraham Accords dynamic in a nutshell. Powerful regional actors choosing cooperation over hostility, even though history would justify suspicion, even war. That choice is strength. In fact, such restraint requires more courage than aggression. The Netziv adds an incredible psychological insight. Yaakov sends the gifts before Esav arrives and doesn't wait until they meet to give them, because timing shapes perception. A gift when you meet in person feels like kind of bribery. But a gift sent beforehand communicates goodwill without anxiety. In other words, success in diplomacy depends not just on what you do, but on how and when you do it. This is the Abraham Accords in Torah language. Timing was everything. Arab states saw Iran rising, American commitment wavering, and an opportunity for regional stability. Israel understood the moment and acted with precision. The Netziv's Yaakov is not appeasing blindly. He is shaping the context that allows diplomacy to succeed. The Malbim insists that the three strategies are not three options, they are three simultaneous obligations. He writes that each one counters a different dimension of Esav's danger. The gift softens Esav's emotion. The prayer aligns Yaakov with divine protection, and the military preparation addresses practical risk. Malbim's Yaakov is remarkably modern, a leader who understands that diplomacy without security is naive, but security without diplomacy is reckless. Israel's posture toward the Gulf states works exactly this way. If you put all these mefarshim together, a breathtaking pattern emerges. Rashi teaches that with some adversaries you begin with appeasement because you don't assume they are irredeemable enemies. Ramban explains that Yaakov's appeasement is strategic, not weakness, and that practical preparation, including the possibility of war, always remains on the table. According to the Sforno, war is the absolute last resort, but if it becomes necessary, one must fight decisively because survival demands it. Rav Hirsch argues that restraint and diplomacy are themselves expressions of strength and moral confidence. In the Netziv's reading, diplomacy succeeds only when approached with psychological calibration and wise timing, and the Malbim adds that genuine peace requires parallel tracks: goodwill, faith, and simultaneous military preparedness. Diplomacy without deterrence is naive, and deterrence without diplomacy is reckless. This is why Israel embraces countries like the UAE and Bahrain while confronting Iran and Hamas, and why secret talks with Saudi Arabia continue even as war rages in Gaza, because not all enemies are the same. Some want stability, others want chaos. Some see coexistence as opportunity, others see it as betrayal. of their ideology. And Yaakov understood this. He treated Esav as someone dangerous but reachable. Israel treats moderate Arab states the same way. Which brings us to another element of Parshat Vayishlach, which seems at complete odds with what we've been saying until now. If Yaakov's meeting with Esav offers a model for diplomacy with rational adversaries, the Dinah Shechem episode presents the opposite challenge. How do you respond to a predator, someone for whom restraint, negotiation, and coexistence mean absolutely nothing? The Torah gives us an uncomfortable but essential answer. Shechem doesn't simply sin. He violated the one ethical principle that all societies, even the most primitive, instinctively protect: the dignity and autonomy of another human being. Shechem is a prince, the son of the local ruler. He has power, position, privilege, and he uses it to attack a vulnerable teenage girl who wandered into his city. In the ancient world, this was not unusual. In the Torah, it is treated as a seismic rupture. Dinah's brothers, Shimon and Levi, react immediately and furiously. They demand justice, they demand boundaries, they demand accountability. And when Shechem's entire city tries to whitewash the crime through a political marriage, as it were, arrangement, the brothers see right through it. This is not diplomacy, it is complicity. So they act. They brutally annihilate the entire city. And Yaakov is horrified. Yaakov's argument is not moral, it is strategic. You have made me vulnerable, he says, and I am few in number. Yaakov fears the practical consequences. He has just maneuvered through a near disaster with Esav by relying on restraint, wisdom, timing, and diplomacy. And now his sons have detonated a powder keg. Yaakov fears what Ramban later calls the backlash that a small nation must always calculate. But then comes one of the most powerful replies in the entire Torah. The brothers respond with a rhetorical question so forceful that the Torah does not even answer it. Hakazona ya'aseh achisenu? Shall our sister be treated like a harlot? Their point is unmistakable. There are moments when the moral cost of appeasement is too high. There are moments when failing to act is worse than acting. There are moments when diplomacy becomes moral surrender. Ramban, astonishingly, especially given his earlier emphasis on appeasement, defends Shimon and Levi's actions. He argues that the people of Shechem were all complicit, legally, because they violated the Noahide requirement to establish a system of justice and failed to punish Shechem for abducting and assaulting Dinah. And they were also morally guilty because they willingly enabled a predatory prince who seized women whenever he wished. For the Ramban, Shimon and Levi did not commit a massacre. They executed a justified act of judgment against a society that had forfeited its moral right to coexist peacefully. Abarbanel adds another angle. Their action wasn't revenge, it was deterrence. A people that cannot protect their own daughters cannot survive. And Sforno goes further. They acted because no one else would. Who would have defended Dinah had they not acted? Who would defend Israel and the Jewish people if not for the IDF? No one. And in the matter of the debate between Yaakov and his sons, the Torah does something extraordinary. It does not resolve the dispute. And even though Yaakov criticizes them again on his deathbed, he never revokes their moral claim. It's fascinating. The Torah lets both voices stand, the voice of diplomacy and the voice of defiance, because Jewish morality requires both. Diplomacy without courage is weakness, and courage without strategy is recklessness. Real leadership demands both instincts deployed in the right moment. The modern application, I think, is painfully clear. October 7th was not a political dispute. It was not a land claim. It was not an uprising. It was Shechem raping Dinah. It was the violent predation by Hamas against the Jewish state. Hamas, which glorifies cruelty, celebrates violence, and announces to the world, not in whispers but in loud, gleeful broadcasts, that the torture of Jews is a religious victory. The murder, the mutilation, the kidnappings, the rape, it was not a conflict, it was the collapse of moral order, and Israel reacted exactly like Shimon and Levi, decisively, furiously, and without apology, because when confronted with an ideology that openly declares its intent to repeat October 7th, as they say, again and again, diplomacy becomes complicity. You do not negotiate with predators. You do not appease those who revel in atrocity. You do not send gifts to Shechem. You act, and you act decisively, not because you lack empathy, but because you have a responsibility to prevent future victims. It is astonishing then, though not surprising, that Israel's morally necessary response to October 7th is attacked as genocide. This is the Shechem strategy turned inside out. A violent aggressor suddenly claims to be the victim the moment accountability arrives. Shimon and Levi might be considered violent, but only by those who ignore the original crime. Israel is called genocidal only by those who erase October 7th from the story. In both cases, the accusation is not about fact, it is about narrative manipulation. The moral logic remains the same. When evil is confronted, evil always calls the confrontation immoral. And the Torah teaches us not to fall for it. Now, the contrast crystallizes. Esav is dangerous but rational enough to engage, and that invites diplomacy. Shechem, on the other hand, is predatory and shameless, leaving no room for negotiation and demanding confrontation. In the modern world, the same distinction is clear. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Bahrain, may not have been warm toward Israel historically, but they are sober, pragmatic actors who can become partners in stability. Diplomacy works with them, just as it did with Esav. But Hamas, Iran, and Hezbollah are built on an ideology of annihilation. They resemble Shechem far more than Esav, and they must therefore be met with the resolve of Shimon and Levi. Yaakov's posture towards Esav helps us understand the logic of the Abraham Accords. Shimon and Levi's response to Dinah, Shechem, helps us understand Israel's war against Hamas. It is the same Torah, but there are two distinct models, each applied in its appropriate moment. Now, if you step back from the drama of Parshat Vayishlach, Yaakov bowing before Esav, Dinah's incident with Shechem, Shimon and Levi storming the city, something extraordinary appears. The Torah is teaching us that not all enemies are the same, and not all dangers require the same response. It sounds simple, but it is profound, because the world loves simple narratives, black and white, good guys and bad guys, Hollywood simplicity, a single moral rule that applies everywhere, all the time. But the Torah rejects that. Vayishlach shows us two opposite moral instincts, caution and confrontation, and insists that both are true, both are holy, both are necessary. The hard part is not choosing between them. The hard part is knowing when to use each one and to use it correctly. Yaakov prepares for war but leans hard toward peace. That is the way to deal with an Esav that has changed his attitude. But then comes the other side of the spectrum. When dealing with actors like Hamas, Hezbollah, or the Iranian regime, groups that openly delight in cruelty, glorify death, and celebrate atrocities, the Torah's message is different. This is Shechem. Diplomacy here becomes dangerous self-delusion. Shimon and Levi scream the question that echoes through Jewish history. Hakazona yase es achisenu? Shall our sister be treated like a harlot? Shall our people be ravaged, mutilated, and massacred, and we simply manage the crisis? Shall our hostages be paraded, abused, tortured, and we shrug and negotiate endlessly? Shall our borders be breached and our civilians hunted, and we pretend we have partners for peace? There are moments when restraint is noble, and there are moments when restraint is sin. October 7th settled the question. The brilliance of Parshat Vayishlach is that it does not instruct us to choose one path. It commands us to live with both. Appease when appeasement is productive, fight when confrontation is unavoidable. Distinguish between the dangerous and the predatory. Recognize when diplomacy is an opportunity and when it is a trap. Israel's modern reality, a peace partner on one side of the map and a genocidal terror group on the other, is simply the ancient tension of Vayishlach living in real time. The world looks at Israel's war against Hamas and asks, why so aggressive? Because they ignore or forget October 7th and pretend that it is an anomaly. But the Torah reads the entire story. It remembers the original crime. It refuses to erase the moral starting point. Those who accuse Israel of genocide are simply ignoring the evil of Hamas. They are ignoring the original violence and condemning the response. But the Torah teaches us a mature moral vocabulary. Diplomacy is holy when facing a reformed Esav, but confrontation is holy when facing a violent, unreformed Shechem. And the wisdom is knowing the difference. That is why the Torah gives us both stories in one parsha, because reality does not offer the luxury of a single moral instinct. It demands courage and prudence, force and restraint, strength and sensitivity. Before we leave Vayishlach, it is worth bringing in a voice from the modern era whose moral clarity mirrors the Torah's distinction between Esav and Shechem more than any other. I'm talking about Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, the first chief rabbi of the modern state of Israel, a man who walked through the ashes of Europe and witnessed, more than perhaps any Jew of his generation, what happens when evil is appeased and when cruelty is ignored. Rav Herzog was not a general. He was not a politician. He was a rabbi, a gentle, scholarly rabbi with a poetic soul, a phenomenal memory, and a deep-seated love for the Jewish people. And yet it was Rav Herzog, perhaps more than anyone else, who articulated the Jewish moral framework for when to appease and when to confront, the very distinction Vayishlach lays out. During the 1930s and 1940s, as Jews were beaten, humiliated, expelled, and finally murdered en masse across Europe, Rav Herzog pleaded with world leaders to act. Again and again, he encountered polite words, diplomatic caution, and moral paralysis masquerading as restraint, and he warned again and again that Jewish gentleness must never become self-destruction. In his view, gentleness may be the badge of Israel, but when gentleness becomes suicide, it ceases to be moral at all. This is Shimon and Levi in one sentence. Rav Herzog was reminding the world, and us, that Jewish ethics do not command self-annihilation. We are not asked to bow permanently to every Esav in the hope that he will eventually soften. Yes, gentleness, as he said, is our badge. We don't worship violence, we don't glorify war, we don't celebrate blood. But if our gentleness allows cruelty to flourish or puts Jewish lives in danger, then our gentleness becomes immoral. This is not florid rhetoric, it is straight up Torah. It is the message of Vayishlach. But at the same time, Rav Herzog also understood the other side, the Yaakov side, the necessity of diplomacy, relationship building, appeasement where appropriate. He met kings and presidents, crossed continents for political conversations, begged governments to open their doors to Jewish refugees, and worked tirelessly to create alliances that might save even a remnant of the Jewish people. Yet even in those diplomatic efforts, he drew a clear red line. He insisted that peace is a sacred ideal, but only with those who genuinely seek it. With those who glorify cruelty, peace becomes deception. Yaakov's gestures toward Esav worked because Esav, at that moment, could be reached could be calmed, he could be engaged. The Abraham Accords show that this still happens. Adversaries can become partners when their goals shift towards stability rather than chaos. But with a Shechem, someone who treats others as objects, who boasts of predation, diplomacy becomes a trap. A smile becomes camouflage. Negotiation becomes surrender. Rav Herzog's warning that false peace is itself a form of deception is essentially the modern phrasing of Shimon and Levi's cry, Hakazona yase es achisenu. Are we really going to pretend this is normal? For Rav Herzog, pretending that a predator can be pacified is not restraint, it is moral failure. And then there is Rav Herzog's third great principle, articulated in 1947 when the British accused the Yishuv of overreacting to Arab militias. Almost word for word, the accusation levelled at Israel today. Rav Herzog argued that when faced with those who seek our destruction, our duty is not merely to defend ourselves, it is to ensure they cannot try again. This is the clearest articulation we have of the Jewish obligation not only to respond to cruelty but to prevent its recurrence. Rav Herzog was speaking about the future state of Israel, but he was also echoing the Rishonim and Achronim, and he was certainly echoing Parshat Vayishlach. Shimon and Levi were not exacting revenge. As we said, they were ensuring that Shechem, a city that normalized the abuse of a powerless girl, and all the surrounding cities and nations, would never repeat the crime, not against Dinah and not against anyone else. And Israel today, confronting the aftermath of October 7th, is operating under Rav Herzog's principle. A moral society has an obligation to eliminate the capability of predatory forces to harm innocents ever again. Restraint in such moments is not virtue, it is negligence. Truthfully, it is complicity. Rav Herzog's life embodied this message. After the war, he spent years traveling across Europe, searching for hidden Jewish children, confronting bishops, challenging governments, sometimes begging and sometimes demanding. He wept for every child taken. He fought for every child he could return. Why? Because in Rav Herzog's worldview, shaped by Tanakh, shaped by Halacha, shaped by millennia of Jewish experience, the Jewish people are obligated to protect the vulnerable, to confront the cruel, and to never again rely on the kindness of predators. He never confused Esav with Shechem. He never confused diplomacy with delusion. And he never allowed moral language to be weaponized against Jewish self-defense. Rav Herzog gave our generation the language and the courage to say, yes, we love peace. Yes, we pursue diplomacy. Yes, we seek partnership with those who seek stability. But no, we will not offer our necks to those who seek destruction. We will not pretend a predator can be appeased, and we will not allow cruelty to become a recurring feature of Jewish life ever again. In 1946, after the liberation of Europe, Rav Herzog traveled from country to country, searching for more than the 10,000 Jewish children. That's the number, 10,000, who had been hidden in monasteries, convents and churches, farms and orphanages during the Holocaust. Many had arrived as infants. Some no longer remembered their names. Many, heartbreakingly, no longer knew they were Jewish. They didn't know they were Jewish. The church had promised in many cases explicitly that when the war ended, when the danger was over, the Jewish children would be returned. But when the war ended, these promises evaporated. Local priests refused to cooperate. Church officials invented bureaucratic hurdles. Many institutions claimed the children were better off as Christians. Into this impossible battlefield stepped Rav Herzog, a slight, soft-spoken scholar with a booming conscience. One of the most dramatic episodes occurred in Toulouse in France, where dozens of Jewish children were being held in Catholic custody. The Archbishop refused to release them. He argued that since the children had been baptized, by the way, often against halachic and parental will, I mean, nobody allowed them to be baptized. But he said they were now Christian and could not be given back. It would confuse them, he said. It would harm their spiritual well-being. He expected Rav Herzog to negotiate politely. He expected diplomacy. He expected appeasement. What he got was Shimon and Levi. Rav Herzog fixed his eyes on the Archbishop and he said, "These children are ours. Their parents were murdered as Jews, and you will not keep the remnant of Israel in your hands." The Archbishop protested. He said that the church had the law, the pastoral duty, and the children's supposed needs in their hearts. Rav Herzog's voice rose. "I come from a people whose children were burned alive. Don't speak to me about their souls. Their souls are ours." Then, in a moment that was witnessed and later recorded by his assistant, Rav Herzog placed both hands on the Archbishop's table and declared, "If you do not release them, I will go from church to church, from convent to convent, from town to town, and I will take them back with my own hands." The room froze. This was not diplomacy, this was moral ferocity, the force of truth spoken without fear. And guess what? The Archbishop relented. Dozens of Jewish children in southern France were released in the following weeks. Many would later settle in Israel. They would marry, build Jewish homes, and raise Jewish children. Unbelievable. Their descendants number in many thousands. So, to conclude, when you look at Parshat Vayishlach, it is tempting to treat the two great episodes, Yaakov's meeting with Esav and the story of Dinah, as unrelated. One is diplomacy, the other is violence. One is appeasement, the other is confrontation. One is gentleness, the other is fury. But the Torah places them side by side because real life places them side by side. Yaakov teaches us that not every adversary is an enemy, and not every danger requires a sword. Sometimes you bow, you send gifts, you de-escalate tensions. You build relationships because the other side is capable of peace, capable of restraint, capable of the Abraham Accords. With Esav, Yaakov models dignity, strategy, and respect. But then there is Shechem. There are moments when appeasement is not diplomacy, but delusion, when restraint is not virtue, but betrayal, when politeness becomes permission for cruelty to flourish. Shimon and Levi refuse this. They cry out, "Hakazoino yases achiseno?" Will our sister be treated like an object and we simply smile and negotiate? And the Torah does not correct them. The Torah absorbs both voices, Yaakov's caution and Shimon and Levi's fire, because Jewish morality demands both instincts, deployed with wisdom and with courage. On October 7th, Vayishlach came into play. Israel behaves towards its Abraham Accord partners and future partners exactly as Yaakov behaved towards Esav, with respect, with diplomatic imagination, and with the courage to build partnerships, even with former adversaries. Meanwhile, Israel behaves towards Hamas exactly as Shimon and Levi behaved towards Shechem, with the moral clarity that you do not appease those who revel in cruelty. When the world calls Israel excessive, aggressive, or genocidal, it is missing the point. They are erasing the original crime, ignoring the violated victim, and condemning those who refuse to pretend that evil is normal. Rav Herzog's attitude is not a commentary. He was living Torah. He was Yaakov in the halls of the Vatican, bowing, negotiating, pleading for Jewish lives, and he was Shimon and Levi in Toulouse, slamming his hands on a bishop's desk, declaring, "These children are ours, and I will take them back with my own hands." Rav Herzog taught the world that gentleness is the badge of Israel, but when gentleness becomes suicide, it becomes treason. He taught that peace is sacred, but only with those who genuinely seek it. He taught that when faced with those who seek our destruction, our duty is not merely to defend ourselves, but to ensure they cannot try again. Rav Herzog lived Vayishlach the way Israel lives it today. And so the final message of this shir is not complicated at all. It is as old as Yaakov, as fierce as Shimon and Levi, and as modern as Rav Herzog. We pursue peace with those who desire peace. We confront evil where it reveals itself, and we never confuse the two. In fact, we do not allow anyone else to confuse us either. And this is the message the world most needs to hear. A message written not only in our texts and in our history, but in our very survival. Diplomacy is holy, military strength is holy, and the Torah teaches us when each of these is required. Which brings me to the end of the shir. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Thank you.